Introduction. It started not with bullets, but with tariffs. By 2018, U.S. China tension had escalated beyond diplomatic spats. The flashpoint was trade, but beneath it lay deeper issues: intellectual property IP, technology dominance, and global influence. The U.S. launched a trade offensive, accusing China of unfair practices. China retaliated, and a silent war began, not on battlefields, but in ports, boardrooms, and research labs. 1. The Spark. 2018 Section 301 Investigation and Tariffs. 1.1 U.S. Allegations. In early 2018, the Trump administration initiated a sweeping Section 301 investigation. The U.S. concluded that China compelled foreign firms to transfer technology. Intellectual property violations were rampant, often covertly enforced through joint ventures. State subsidies gave Chinese firms an unfair advantage in global competition. These claims became the basis for imposing tariffs on roughly $50 to $60 billion in Chinese goods. CIGI, time, +1. 1.2, China's defense. Beijing rebuffed the accusations. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Hua Chunying called them distortions of reality, arguing that China was advancing a fair, innovation-driven economy. She accused the U.S. of weaponizing national security to suppress normal business activities. People China. 2. Escalation. Trade war begins. 2.1 Tariff imposition. By mid-2018, the U.S. had slapped 25% tariffs on over $200 billion of Chinese imports. China fired back with retaliatory tariffs on American agricultural goods and industrial exports. 2.2 Real impact. These tariffs hit farmers hard. Soybeans, in particular, were targeted. Risk shifted supply chains across Southeast Asia, though subsequent U.S. tariffs on those nations reduced the appeal of relocation. Financial Times. 3. Technology as battlefield. Semiconductor and security controls. 3.1 Export controls and blacklists. Starting in 2018, the U.S. swiftly labeled Huawei and ZTE as national security threats. Laws such as the National Defense Authorization Act banned their equipment from federal agencies. Both firms were added to the Commerce Department entity list in 2019, barring American companies from selling components without government approval. Timesofindia.indiatimes.com. +8. en.wikipedia.org. +8. Council on Foreign Relations. +8. In 2021, further legislation tightened bans on all telecommunications gear from 5 Chinese firms under the FCC's Secure Equipment Act. en.wikipedia.org. 3.2 Semiconductor restrictions. The U.S. expanded export controls to cover AI chips and advanced memory. These controls restricted China's access to cutting-edge node technologies and lithography tools, especially EUV systems produced by ASML. Reuters.com. +3. en.wikipedia.org. +3. SEO.go/AI. +3. For the tug of war, why this was about the future. 4.1 AI, 5G, and next-gen tech. The contest wasn't just economic. Both sides understood that leadership in AI, 5G, quantum computing, and advanced telecom infrastructure meant shaping global power in the 21st century. The U.S. targeted Huawei to impede its global 5G ambitions. China responded by massively investing in domestic innovation under Made in China 2025. en.wikipedia.org. +2. channelnewsasia.com. +2. For point 2, Huawei's resilience. Despite sanctions, Huawei showed notable recovery, launching Mate 60 and Mate 70 Pro phones with domestically made chips, introducing Harmony OS Next, a proprietary operating system replacing dependence on Google's Android. Reddit.com. +3. SEO.go/AI. +3. TheDiplomat.com. +3. TheDiplomat.com. +3. ChannelNewsAsia.com. +3. Reddit.com. +3. Collaborating with SMIC to produce 7nm chips using older lithography while working around U.S. restrictions. Economic Times, IndiaTimes.com. +4. SEO, go over AI. +4. ChannelNewsAsia.com. +4. Even without true EUV, Huawei's R&D efforts, backed by government subsidies, allowed it to achieve yields of 20 to 50% on chips deemed non-commercial by U.S. standards, with hopes to scale production in 2025. SEO to go over AI. DailySabah.com. Reuters.com. 5. China's countermoves. Innovation under pressure. 5.1. Strategic investments. China heavily invested in downstream chip-making materials and components, photoresist, SiC wafers, gallium nitride chips, through state-backed ventures. These investments aim to circumvent supply chain bottlenecks and reduce dependence on foreign firms. TheDiplomat.com. 5.2. Tech self-reliance under Made in China 2025. The national plan was largely successful. China established global leadership in EVs, solar, high-speed rail, drones, graphene, robotics. Though advanced photolithography lagged behind, China exceeded its auto industry, robotics, and biopharma goals by 2023 to 2024. en.wikipedia.org. +1. These achievements show that sanctions slowed, but did not stop progress toward tech autonomy. 6. Competitive feedback loop. U.S. strategy risks empowering China. 6.1. Accelerating Chinese innovation. Critics argue that U.S. containment inadvertently spurred Chinese tech creativity. Chinese firms like DeepSeek gained prominence by building alternative AI models under hardware constraints. Huawei's refocused strategy produced vertically integrated models for chip design, fabrication, and operating systems. ChannelNewsAsia.com. +2. WSJ.com. +2. 6.2. Rising competitiveness. Despite U.S. sanctions, Huawei made the cut as a listed competitor by NVIDIA in 2025 across chips, cloud services, and infrastructure. Its domestic revenue surged with Mate 70, alongside strong growth in HarmonyOS adoption. CNBC.com. +1. 7. Real-world pivot. Supply chains and global reactions. 7.1. China +1 and added tariffs. To mitigate U.S. tariffs, companies relocated production to Southeast Asia. But new U.S. tariffs on goods transshipped via those countries diminished the value of that strategy. Financial Times. 7.2. Global trade tensions. Recent standoffs include U.S. pressure on China's Russian and Iranian oil purchases, leading Beijing to defend its energy sovereignty. U.S. threats of 100% tariff hikes if China doesn't comply, though Beijing remained defiant. Telecom.Economic Times, IndiaTimes.com. +1. APNews.com. +1. 8. Stakes and implications. Ownership of the future. 8.1. Strategic leadership. This struggle isn't just for economic advantage. It's for global leadership in foundational technologies. U.S. views dominance in AI, 5G, and semiconductors as essential for maintaining global influence. China views technological self-reliance as critical for national security and global autonomy. 8.2. The high cost of decoupling. Global tech fragmentation is rising. Companies face complex trade-offs. Remain allied with the U.S. or risk access to China. Supply chains are duplicated. Global efficiency has dropped. ChannelNewsAsia.com. 8.3. Who's winning? China is narrowing the gap. In 2025, U.S. officials admitted Huawei would produce no more than 200,000 advanced AI chips. Insufficient for domestic demand, but China's AI model lag is now reported at just 3 to 6 months behind U.S. benchmarks. WSJ.com. Reuters.com. Huawei is now a formidable force. Per NVIDIA's description, it is the single most formidable tech company in China. Reddit.com. Yet U.S. restrictions have been effective enough to limit Chinese advancement at the very top tiers. The future remains uncertain, but the costs of miscalculation are high. Chapter 2. A World Divided. Competing for global influence. The new battleground isn't just in the Pacific. It's everywhere. 1. The Belt and Road Initiative. China's strategy to redraw the map. Since its launch in 2013 by President Xi Jinping, the Belt and Road Initiative (BRI) has evolved into perhaps the most ambitious infrastructure undertaking in modern history. It includes over 150 countries, covering more than 60% of global population and nearly one-third of GDP, working across 6 land corridors in the maritime Silk Road to develop roads, railways, ports, power grids, and digital infrastructure. On the surface, BRI presents itself as a development project. It promises easier trade, streamlined logistics, and shared prosperity. But underlying that narrative is a strategic goal: extend China's footprint, economic, political, and normative, across continents. Ports in Sri Lanka, railways in Central Asia, energy pipelines in Africa and Europe are not just logistical nodes. They become levers of influence. China Power Project. Washington sees this as more than diplomacy. It's geopolitics by other means. U.S. analysts argue that through BRI, China is reshaping the global economic order, establishing new regulatory ties, trade standards, and financial dependencies that sideline Western norms. China's financing reveals its ambition. Nearly $1 trillion spent, dwarfing even the Marshall Plan in today's dollars. Recipient countries, eager for development, often incur heavy debts, raising concerns over debt-trap diplomacy, where failure to repay can lead to political leverage. Pakistan's Gwadar port under the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is a widely cited example. The U.S.'s retrenchment from its traditional development aid in the region has given Beijing a vacuum to fill. At the same time, China's charm offensive, including diplomatic reversals on sanctions, high-level visits across Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, signals a deliberate attempt to solidify BRI as a global brand. 2. The U.S. response: alliances, partnerships, and counterflows. Facing China's rising influence, the U.S. responded by reinforcing alliances and promoting alternative regional integration. Initiatives like Build Back Better World, B3W, the Quad, and deeper ties with ASEAN, EU, India, and African states aim to offer a governance-based alternative to China's state-led model. Policy experts emphasize that U.S. strategy hinges on supporting a rules-based order while providing infrastructure finance through multilateral institutions, emphasizing transparency and conditionality. U.S. officials often argue China's scale is unsustainable economically and politically. BRI encourages cronyism, environmental harm, and erosion of sovereignty in recipient states. The aim is to limit China's ability to convert infrastructure into influence and prevent it from crafting the new normal for global governance. Chapter 3. The Battle for the South China Sea. It looks like just water until you realize it could start a war. 1. From reefs to runways, China's artificial islands as strategic bases. Beginning in 2013, China embarked on a massive land reclamation campaign across disputed reefs in the Spratly and Paracel Islands. Mischief Reef, Subi Reef, Fiery Cross Reef, once submerged at high tide, were transformed into fully militarized islands with airstrips over 3,000 meters, radar installations, seaports, and housing for personnel. Though a 2016 ruling by the Permanent Court of Arbitration declared China's historical claims invalid and ruled features like Mischief Reef have no territorial sea entitlement, Beijing rejected the verdict outright. Instead, it consolidated its de facto control, using the islands as strategic platforms to project power far from the mainland. 2. Gray zone tactics. Covert expansion without official war. Rather than overt aggression, China employs gray zone tactics, the calculated use of Coast Guard vessels, maritime militia fishing boats, and law enforcement ships to steadily assert dominance without triggering armed conflict. This strategy acts like wrapping layers of cabbage. Navy, Coast Guard, militia together encircle contested features, pushing rival claimants out of their own zones. This slow squeeze is effective due to scale. Chinese coercive fleets now far outnumber those of other claimant nations. Philippines and Vietnam vessels are frequently blocked, or worse, harassed, sometimes dangerously close, like helicopters fly within feet of Philippine aircraft at Scarborough Shoal. The U.S. argument: UNCLOS allows all nations to navigate and fly over international waters, even within an exclusive economic zone (EEZ), and does not recognize new territorial entitlement from reclaimed, Submerged features. FONUPs are legal exercises aimed at preserving the right of passage for all, not just American vessels. 4. Rising tensions and regional backlash. The stakes grew throughout 2025 with regional solidarity emerging in response to Chinese assertiveness. The Philippines Defense Secretary warned that any attempt to restrict flights or impose an ADIZ over the South China Sea would prompt collective resistance from allies, including the U.S. and Australia. This follows near collisions with Chinese helicopters and ongoing maritime standoffs. Meanwhile, India and the Philippines conducted their first joint naval exercise in the South China Sea, a clear symbolic challenge to Beijing. China criticized the drills as interference, but for Manila and New Delhi, it was a statement of strategic alignment. 5. Why this waterway matters. The South China Sea isn't just a theater of regional tension. It's one of the world's most critical trade arteries. More than $5 trillion in goods pass through its maritime lanes annually. Maritime control here translates into global influence. For China, establishing effective control over the region affords both security and economic leverage. For the U.S. and other maritime powers, acquiescing would redefine international law and undermine decades of norms. 6. Law versus power. The clash of interpretations. At the heart of the dispute lies a battle over maritime interpretation. China insists that military navigation in its EEZ should be regulated to protect sovereignty, even though the U.S. has never ratified UNCLOS. Critics argue China uses such claims selectively, legitimizing its own maneuvers while rejecting international rulings. The U.S., by contrast, treats FONUPs as symbolic acts to preserve long-standing maritime freedom for all nations, as reflected in customary international law. In lectures, U.S. strategists warn that if China's claims go unchallenged, it sets a precedent. Countries may unilaterally convert submerged features into sovereign bases, undermining core norms of the rules-based global system. Interconnected stakes. Infrastructure, influence, sea control. These two chapters, BRI's global expansion and South China Sea militarization, are not isolated. They form parts of a unified Chinese strategy, extend economic reach globally while consolidating regional dominance at sea. BRI builds a soft power network and economic dependencies. The South China Sea builds hard power and sets precedents in contested maritime zones. Together, they create both economic corridors and security choke points, allowing China to wield influence from Karachi to Manila to Nairobi. 5. Human rights versus sovereignty. Freedom or interference. It depends on which side you ask. U.S. criticism. Calling out China. The U.S. has repeatedly condemned China's actions in Xinjiang, where over 1 million Uyghurs and other predominantly Muslim minorities face mass detention, surveillance, forced labor, and reports of coercive sterilization. Washington has called these actions genocide and crimes against humanity. In Hong Kong, the imposition of a broad national security law in 2020 led to sweeping arrests of pro-democracy activists, the suppression of opposition media, and the curbing of free political expression. U.S. policy responses include sanctions against Chinese and Hong Kong officials under legislation like the Uyghur Sanctions Accountability Act. In 2025 bipartisan bills, the Transnational Repression Policy Act and the Uyghur Genocide and Sanctions Accountability Act, were introduced to further penalize officials and deter state-backed coercion abroad. China's counterattack, hypocrisy as defense. Beijing dismisses these criticisms as politically motivated attacks. Chinese officials have branded U.S. accusations as distortions, claiming they reveal double standards and ideological bias. China argues that U.S. reports ignore its own violations, citing racism, police brutality, and failures in confronting global crises like Gaza as proof of hypocrisy. According to Chinese messaging, the U.S. seeks to undermine China's development using human rights as a political weapon while ignoring its own deep-rooted issues, what critics call weaponizing human rights. The power struggle over values. This battlefield is not about morality alone. It's about soft power, narrative control, and legitimizing global leadership. The U.S. casts itself as defender of universal norms, while China claims alternative sovereignty-based narratives that emphasize state-run development and non-interference. At the UN and other international forums, The U.S. leads campaigns to spotlight China's rights violations. China responds by organizing allied developing states to resist what it calls politicization of human rights. This tug-of-war shapes how the international community views notions of rights, governance, and legitimacy. 6. Ghosts in the wires, the Cyber Cold War. Wars aren't just fought on land, sea, or air anymore. Chinese cyber operations, scale and persistence. China is now accused of mounting the most sophisticated cyber espionage campaign the U.S. has ever faced. In 2023 and 2024 alone, cybersecurity firms recorded more than 330 major cyber attacks linked to Chinese Advanced Persistent Threat APT groups, doubling prior year's levels. Notable groups include Salt Typhoon, Volt Typhoon, and Silk Typhoon, linked respectively to the Ministry of State Security and the People's Liberation Army. Crucially, these groups target software providers, telecom networks, utilities, and federal agencies, not only for data theft, but for long-term network persistence. The aim appears to be laying groundwork for future disruption during possible escalations, including potential conflicts around Taiwan. Notable incidents and U.S. responses. In August 2024, at least 2 major U.S. telecom providers, Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, had their call metadata compromised and attacks traced to Salt Typhoon. Data captured included timestamps, call logs, and wiretapping system info, affecting campaign staff for political figures, including Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. The U.S. Treasury Department was also breached in late 2024. Attackers access employee workstations through a remote support tool breach. In early 2025, China confirmed it was pursuing 3 alleged U.S. operatives accused of hacking Chinese infrastructure during the Asian Games, highlighting that cyber conflict goes both ways. Perhaps most controversially, the Chinese Cybersecurity Association has accused the U.S. of exploiting a Microsoft zero-day vulnerability to infiltrate Chinese military email servers between 2022 and 2023, a claim the U.S. has not confirmed. Invisible front lines, real threats. This digital battlefield lacks physical borders, but networks are targets, and damage can be irreversible. Both sides now deploy cyber as both a preemptive tool and deterrence instrument. The U.S. is investing billions into offensive cyber capabilities, while China increasingly uses private sector proxies under government direction to conduct espionage, obscuring state involvement and increasing scale. 7. Circling the dragon, alliances and encirclement. China sees a ring tightening around it, and it doesn't like what it sees. The Quad and AUKUS, regional multipliers of U.S. power. In response to China's growing power, Washington has deepened strategic cooperation with regional allies. The Quad Alliance, U.S., Japan, India, Australia, has expanded joint exercises, infrastructure investment pledges, and principles for a free, open, inclusive Indo-Pacific. AUKUS, U.S., UK, Australia, centers on delivering nuclear-powered submarines and advanced military tech to Australia, seen by China as direct containment of its western flank. Combined with formal U.S. military alliances in Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and rotational deployments in Singapore and Thailand, these networks enhance U.S. strategic depth in ways China currently cannot rival. Chinese perception, containment versus defense. Chinese analysts view these minilateral groups and military expansions as encirclement. Retired PLA Colonel Zhou Bo noted China's suspects Australia may serve as a mediator, but ultimately, Beijing sees alliances like AUKUS as components of a U.S.-led containment strategy. In turn, China has advanced its own Blue Dragon strategy, focused on developing strategic depth via maritime, land, and peripheral theaters to bypass Western containment efforts. 8. The bigger picture, a clash for the 21st century. This isn't just a rivalry. It's a question. Who will define the future? Now, more than ever, the U.S. and China represent competing visions for a global order. The U.S. leans on historical institutions, alliances, and universal principles, attempting to preserve the global architecture established post-World War II. China frames an alternative, state-led development, sovereign choice, and a non-interference ethos, backed by expanding networks of infrastructure and influence. Neither side seeks war in the traditional sense, but each is unwilling to yield leadership. The real battle, who writes the rules, in technology, governance, security, and diplomacy. In this high-stakes competition, even seemingly isolated arenas, human rights, cyber capabilities, alliance networks, are interconnected. Each reinforces the symbolism and substance of global leadership. Conclusion: human rights versus sovereignty, a values conflict that shapes international legitimacy and soft power narratives. Cyber Cold War, digital espionage, and zero-day vulnerabilities are now front lines of strategic deterrence. Alliances and encirclement. Multipolar alignments exert geopolitical pressure, with China interpreting them as containment. This is not just a geopolitical rivalry. It's a contest over the architecture of the 21st century, and within it lie the possibilities and dangers that will define our collective future.